In the darkest hour, the ancestral spirits of Kuro came to me, lingering, whispering. They told me that demon hunters are clinging to the past, corrupted and weakened by their fascination of feeble primary attacks. They told me that I, Oroth, a master of summons, a necromancer, has to open their eyes. So it begins. We are stepping into a new era. Let me introduce the new Demon Hunter meta.
Hello guys, this is Oroth and a warm welcome back to my channel. In today's video we will finally highlight a new Demon Hunter build that focuses on summons that you can use in dungeons. And a lot of people has been writing comments on Reddit for quite some time about how weak Demon Hunters are at the moment, and they are complaining about the new essences that are released that are focusing more on traps and sentries and summons in general. And I can understand this because Demon Hunter has been a class that has been utilizing the primary attack for a long time. And it doesn't matter if it has been in PvP or PvE. Most Demon Hunters, they are using the primary attack as their main source of damage. And it has been working okay, but also the reason for why people has been complaining a lot about the Demon Hunter is because when you compare the damage output of the primary attack Demon Hunter compared to many other classes, it's been fairly weak. But that's why it's nice to try something else and do something new. And that's what I'm trying to bring to the table here with this video. And yeah, I'm gonna highlight one build that you can use in dungeons, and let's dive straight into it. First, let us go through the timeline of today's video. So first of all, I'm gonna explain the concept of the build very briefly. So what does it do? And second, I'm gonna show you which skills I'm using in this dungeon build. Then we're gonna talk about set pieces and what different options there are. Then we're gonna look at the essences I'm using. We're gonna talk a little bit about legendary gems. And I also want to show you the Reforge I'm using, and also highlight which magical attributes you should look for in certain items to maximize the output of this build. And finally, we're also gonna look at some gameplay to see the build in action, and also where I can show you how do you engage a boss, in which order do you use your skills, etc. So that's the timeline of this video. So let us begin to talk a little bit about the build. It has incredible burst damage. It has a few different choices that you can choose between. And also, of course, now the dots are coming up here in a strange order, but we're going to utilize the summons. and the Demon Hunter has received a lot of new tools. And when I, as a necromancer, has been analyzing the new essences coming out, in comparison with a lot of others, I know how strong summons can be if you build your character correctly. So I've actually been very excited to switch to Demon Hunter to try them out. And I can already say that Demon Hunter is extremely strong right now. And there are things that I've been able to do with the Demon Hunter that I have not been able to do with the Necromancer. So we're going to talk a little bit about that later. But yeah, Demon Hunter is one of the strongest classes in PvE right now. So let's move on and look on the skills. For this build, I'm using the following skills. For primary attack, I use the crossbow shot. Of course, the primary attack will not be our main source of damage, but yeah, it has a little effect. And yeah, it's also nice for me as a necromancer to play with the crossbow shot because I am a little bit more mobile and it just feels good to use it. But you could also use the explosive arrow. I think it's just as good as this one. If you want to try it out, it's fine. We're gonna also use the strafe skill. We're gonna use knife traps. We're gonna use sentries, and we're gonna use vengeance. So these are the skills we're using for this build. The set we're gonna use, or that I'm using, is the Shepherd set. And it's very, very good if you're playing with summons. And I run with 6 pieces in this version of the build. But you can of course change out 2 pieces for Issatar if you need some more movement speed when you enter a dungeon. And it depends a little bit on your teammates. If you run with a barbarian, maybe they can buff you. You don't need the movement speed from Issatar. And it also depends on the dungeon, because some dungeons requires more movement speed than others. If you go to Namari, for example, you don't need that much movement speed because you don't have to walk that far, and you will be fighting most of the time. So you will not lose any time if you are a little bit slower when it comes to movement speed. But yeah, there are some options, but the 6-piece Shepherd set is so strong because every 40 seconds you get a huge attack speed buff at 60%. So it turns your summons into true monsters when this buff is active. And it's active for 12 seconds, which is quite a long time. And also, in most dungeons, you are perhaps running to a boss and then you engage. So then you will trigger this effect. And until you reach the next boss, the effect will be ready again. So I would say that it's very likely that this effect will be active when you need it the most. Of course, there are some times when it activates when you maybe don't need it, so it's not perfect. But the impact that this attack speed buff has on your damage output is so amazing. So that's why I really love to use the full 6-piece set. So yeah, just a little bit about set and different thoughts and options that you can use. So let us talk quick about the essences I'm using in this specific build. Let me put on the pointer here. First of all, in the first offhand slot, I use Fallow Farm, which turns my strafe skill into a summon. You can actually summon 2 strafe summons at the same time. And if we look on my first main hand, I use Watcher's Salvation, which gives me an extra charge of sentries. And when I play a summon build, the more summons I can use at the same time, the better, of course. On the second offhand, I use One's Own Fusillade, I don't know how it's pronounced. But what it basically does is that whenever my sentry is damaging an enemy, it applies a debuff, so I do more damage to that target. In my second main hand, I use Turmoil, which also adds the effect to my strafe summons that they also launch some homing missiles that does some extra damage. So it's also a good essence for this build. If we look on the pant slot, I use Journey Abundant. What it does is that whenever I use Vengeance, I create a red circle on the floor, and every summon and myself, if we are standing inside this circle, all of us will do extra damage every half a second. And this is very, very strong if you have many summons at the same time. For my shoulders, I use Slink Pranks, and what it does is that whenever an enemy is affected by a knife trap, their armor gets demolished, so they take more damage. So that's also very good to include a debuff, another debuff in this build. In my chest piece, I use Yearling Kiln, and yeah, whenever I use Vengeance, it summons my inner demon, which also counts as a summon, and they do massive damage, or it does massive damage. It's really cool. And finally, I use Boar at the Door, which turns my sentries into untargetable sentries. And also very important is that it reduces the cooldown a lot on the sentries. And that's the reason why I use this helmet instead of, for example, the helmet that turns my sentries into summons that shoot mortars. That does a lot of damage, but the cooldown is very, very long, and I want my skills to be ready whenever I reach the next boss in a dungeon, so therefore I picked Boar at the Door. What's also interesting to mention here, that both the sentries using this helmet and the strafe summons, they are unkillable, and that is very, very good for some types of content. In dungeons it doesn't really matter, but in PvP and in raids and gauntlet, it's very, very strong when a summon can't be killed. So just an important thing to note here. So these are the skills I'm using for this specific build, and let's move on to the legendary gems. Let's talk about the legendary gems, and of course here there are different options that you can use. This is one of the versions I'm using, and I'm gonna go through the legendary gems, both the 1 stars, the 2 stars and the 5 stars. And if we look first on the 1-star gems, I'm in this version only including one of them, and that's Berserker's Eye. Berserker's Eye is a very, very strong 1-star gem. I have told you guys before in other videos, but it both gives damage and critical hit chance, and critical hit chance is very, very important. And I will also say that, yeah, you could include Freedom and Devotion into a version of this build, and Freedom and Devotion increases the duration of your summons, but for dungeons, you often kill off the enemies quite fast, so then the extra duration is not needed. So then I prefer extra damage. So that's why I chose Berserker's Eye over Freedom and Devotion. If we look on the 2-star gems, I'm using Pain Clasp, I'm using Mother's Lament, I'm using Viper's Bite, Bloody Reach, and Follower's Burden. And if we look at Pain Clasp first, it increases the damage I do to any target affected by a continuous damage effect. And what is very good is that I have an activator for this myself, since I'm using Viper's Bite. And whenever I damage a target, it will afflict the poison to the target. And this is the reason why I include Viper's Bite, because that's how I activate the Pain Clasp. And the good thing about Viper's Bite is that it's 100%. Whenever you apply damage, you will also apply the poison. So yeah, that's very good compared to Seeping Bile, for example. Because yeah, if you manage to apply the Seeping Bile effect, which is a 5-star gem, to an enemy, it might be a little bit better, but there's only a tiny chance that each time you make damage, you will apply that effect. And if it takes 2 or 3 seconds before the effect is applied, it will take too long before the effect from Pain Clasp is active. So that's why I prefer to use Viper's Bite over Seeping Bile. We can also talk about Mother's Lament. What it does is that it increases your critical hit chance for a period of time, and this effect can trigger every 20 seconds. And it's the same as with the 6-piece effect from Shepherd. When you engage a boss, the first boss in a dungeon, this effect will go active, and before you need it again, it will be ready. So most of the time when I need it, it's active. And at rank 10, it gives me 34 or 36%, I don't remember exactly, critical hit chance, which is massive. Because like I said, critical hit chance is important to increase the damage output. I also use Bloody Reach, which is a super legendary gem for summoners. And what's good about Bloody Reach is that the further away I stand from the target, the more damage I will deal to it. But for some reason, it has doubled effect on my summons. So if I'm standing 8 yards away from the enemy, I get the maximum damage effect at 24% if the gem is at rank 10. But it gives the double effect to my summons. So they get 24 times 2 for some reason. So you have to include Bloody Reach in your summoner builds because it's so strong. And finally, I also use Follower's Burden. It also gives me extra damage for each summon that I have active. So any type of damage buff from legendary gems is of course very strong and good. And finally, let's look on the 5-star gems. I'm using Blood-Soaked Jade. It also adds extra damage, but it also gives me some movement speed, which is nice. And the star of any summon build when it comes to legendary gems is the Echoing Shade. If you have the Echoing Shade at rank 1, it can only summon 1 clone, but at rank 3 it can summon 2 clones, and at rank 7 it can summon 3 clones. And these clones are actually dealing a lot of damage. So if you are going to play summons, I really recommend you to use Echoing Shade. All of the necromancers, or most of the necromancers, already know this, but now since I'm talking to perhaps a lot of demon hunters who has never utilized summons before, this is a very good lesson to include Echoing Shade if you can. So these are the legendary gems I'm using in this specific build. It's also important when building your character in Diablo Immortal to really focus on the details, because every little change you do will have an effect on your total output and your total impact. So the Reforges is one of those things that you have to think about, which picks you should make. And I have opted for these 5 Reforges on my items. And at the top there we can see that I have damage done by your summons increased by 4%. And of course I don't have to explain why this is good in a summoner build. So it's superb if you're using summons in PvE. And nowadays you can also use summons in PvP. So for a long time this Reforge that increases the damage on my summons has been dead in PvP. But now it's also useful there. So yeah, if you want to play around with summons, I really recommend that you have that Reforge on your items. The other option I opted for is Duration of Beneficial Effects. And this effect is both good for PvE and for PvP. It prolongs all the beneficial effects, both from buffs but also from legendary gems. So for example, when Mother's Lament is active, the duration of the effect will be prolonged the more duration of beneficial effect increased attribute you have on your items. So either from Reforge or from magical attributes on your chest or on your legs, for example. So it's a very, very strong and very good effect. The third option I went for is critical hit damage. And yeah, this is debatable. I know that some people are suggesting that critical hit damage is not as strong as a lot of people are saying. But what we have to remember here is that critical hit damage is stronger for some people than for others. And it's actually based on critical hit chance. So let's say that you, just to make it easy, let's pretend that you have 10% critical hit chance. That means that your 50% critical hit damage, for example, will only be useful 10% of the time, because you only do a critical hit 10% of the time. But if you manage to increase your critical hit chance, the more you're able to do so, the more effectful critical hit damage will become. And when I'm building my character, especially for PvE content, I am always trying to maximize the critical hit chance as much as possible, in order for these two effects to work in symbiosis with each other. So very high critical hit chance, then the critical hit damage becomes crucial. So if you can combine these two, that's when we can start seeing very, very high damage output. So you can do your own investigations. You have to look on your own critical hit chance. It is not something you can fix over a day, but over time, when you find new items, if you manage to increase your critical hit chance, yes, then critical hit damage is one of the best options to go for when it comes to the Reforge. The fourth choice I made is the skill damage increased effect. This one is not the strongest, because it only affects a tiny portion of my damage. But it's good because, yeah, you can see here they have 3 of the same family, so I can summon this Fire Hydra, which is a nice little addition. So it's good to have 3 of the same family in this case. And finally, we also have primary attack damage increased. And what's good to know here is that this Reforge actually affects the damage of my summons as well. The skill damage does affect some aspects of summon damage, but primary attack damage is almost as good as damage done by your summons, because whenever your summon is doing its own primary attack, it will be affected by this Reforge. So that's why I chose to include it. So this is what I have to say about Reforge. What's very, very important in Diablo Immortal when it comes to your impact and your damage output is the magical attributes of your items. And I've been talking about this in some of my other videos, but if you haven't watched them, I'm gonna just explain it briefly here. A lot of people, they are looking for combat rating when they are finding new items. So whenever a new item has dropped that has more combat rating, they maybe switch out their previous item because they want to maximize their combat rating as much as possible. But I will say now that this is not the correct way to build your character. What matters most is that you have the correct setup when it comes to magical attributes. Personally, I'm still using some items from Inferno 1 and Inferno 2 because I have not been able to find Inferno 3 items yet with the correct magical attributes on them. And my recommendation to all of you is that on your helmet, on your helmet, on your shoulder, on your main hands and on your off hands, I recommend you to either look for, let me put on the pointer here, either look for this combination, critical hit chance with critical hit damage, or this combination, primary attack damage with critical hit chance. And this is if you are playing summons, of course, because as I said earlier, primary attack damage also affects the damage of the summons. So the top option, which is the holy grail for me, is the combination critical hit chance and critical hit damage. And this is because my critical hit chance is so high. But it's almost equally good if I find primary attack damage with critical hit chance. So if I'm able to get this on all the items where you can roll this combination, it's very strong. On if you're gonna play a summoner build, on your necklace, on your gloves and on your rings, you want to look for damage done by your summons increased. And this can be up to 10%. And that's the best roll you can find. And here is also a mistake that a lot of people are making, because when you're identifying a new item and it's not exceptional, maybe you just salvage it immediately because you think it's not good. But this is wrong, because when it comes to the set pieces, for example, the exceptional items, they can not have the maximum roll on damage done by your summons increased by 10%, for example. So you actually don't want to find an exceptional item. You want to find a 2-stat item that has the maximum roll. That's the best you can find. And finally, on your defensive items, I'm talking about your waist, your feet, your pants and your chest. The best roll you can get on the magical attribute is beneficial effect duration increased by 7.5%. And this can also not happen on an exceptional item. So be very careful when you are identifying new items, and don't salvage anything that's super good. Because, yeah, they are very hard to find. So if you manage to do it, keep it, don't salvage it. So, let us watch some gameplay together to just see what the build can look like in action. And yeah, the first thing we can note is that the strafe summons are doing their job with very good AoE damage. And this combined with the Vengeance Inner Demon, which makes this red circle, really clears these packs quite fast. And remember, this is going solo in Inferno 3 in Namari. Now I'm running inside of the packs because they're gonna die quite fast, but if I want to optimize, I have to stand a little bit further back to utilize the Bloody Reach. Because the further away you stand from the enemy, the more damage you do. And yeah, I mean, one problem with this build, I have not included Freedom and Devotion, but you could see there that in that case, now I'm doing this solo, but at the end of that phase, my DPS died off a little bit. If I would have used Freedom and Devotion, I would have prolonged my duration a little bit. So it's definitely an option to include it. But when we come to the boss fights here, I want to maximize the damage output to kill the bosses very fast. So then it's better to use Berserker's Eye, in my opinion. I will gain some time doing so. So we start with the Siegbreaker here. So a few seconds before the boss spawns, I'm summoning all the summons and I'm putting down all the knife traps, because it takes a couple of seconds for the knife traps to trigger, and if I time it correctly, they will activate as soon as the boss can take damage. And yeah, I mean, if you look here now, you can see that the damage output is really good. Of course, you have to remember that I have optimized my build a lot for summons, but at least this shows you the potential of this Demon Hunter. And if you use primary attack builds, it's decent, but you will never be able to reach similar damage output with a version of the primary attack builds. Look here now, when I kill Sargoth for example, he's melting in 1 or 2 seconds. So yeah, I mean, I hope that this video was interesting for you, and please feel free to experiment with different summon builds. And yeah, I hope you really enjoyed this video. And before we leave, I would like to say have a very nice day, have an awesome evening, and to all the clan members in Kuro, I would like to say Avrath El Omno Kuro. So thank you a lot. Bye bye.